I'll make my talk three parts. One, what's happened to CalOSHA under the leadership of Jerry Brown appointee Christine Baker, what's happened to her recently in the way of corruption, and what's happening at Hunters Point as a model for what the dysfunction of an agency like CalOSHA that has never even looked at Hunters Point. So let's start with CalOSHA. Steve mentioned some of it, which is this agency. I started in the first Jerry Brown administration when we had 7 public health medical officer doctors on board. We were working with the Department of Health, and we took the lead in a number of very important investigations to protect workers. And then at one point, they decided to transfer us over, all the doctors, to the Department of Industrial Relations. At that time, Don Weil was the director of that, and Art Carter was the head of CalOSHA. Now, at that time, there were only about 11 million workers in California. Now there are 18.5 million workers in California. The number of extra, we call them enforcement officers, that were brought on board at CalOSHA, they did not increase adequately. So at this point, we have 1 enforcement officer per 90,000 workers in California, which is ridiculous. This is the 6th biggest economy in the world in California, and it has a lot of very highly polluting industries and terrible exposures of the workers. And what happened was they gradually diminished both what we were allowed to do as doctors in the OSHA program, but also the number of doctors, till finally, over the years, I was the last remaining public health medical officer in CalOSHA, which is outrageous. When you go in to do an inspection, you have to talk to the workers. You have to look at their medical history, the doctors that have been treating them for these work-related injuries and illness, and you have to come up with a remediation that is in direct proportion to what we found. Well, that became impossible for me toward the end of my stay there because there were just too many places to go at once. So what happened in 2011 was Jerry Brown appointed a woman named Christine Baker. Now, Christine Baker was a new director of the Department of Industrial Relations with that huge explosion at the Chevron plant. Most of you probably remember that in March of 2012. I mean, that was a shocking event where the management at that Chevron plant created that problem. That was a leaky pipe. They let it go. They told the 20 workers to keep it going, and it exploded, and this mushrooming cloud went up. 15,000 inhabitants of Richmond, California had to go to the emergency rooms. The 20 workers barely escaped with their lives. They ran like hell, and they just missed being destroyed. So with that event, I started closely looking at, well, what is CalOSHA? How are they going to handle this? Well, they did go in, and they did investigate, and they did a fairly good, I would call it medium good investigation. It didn't go to the core of it, which was what criminals were responsible for this occurrence at the Chevron plant. But this was never done. They have a legal unit at CalOSHA. They never sent them in. But what did happen was a friend of mine who came on board with me when Jerry Brown's first administration was the chief of CalOSHA at that point. She had been a long time kind of liberal Democrat, and she got the appointment, Ellen Wides. So she oversaw the investigation, and what happened was it took a long time, and I started asking, what's going on? 6 months later, she did do the right thing. She came up with 7 serious violations, willful. Willful means that management knew this was going to happen and allowed it to happen, in fact, helped it happen. So this story goes on. I don't want to go into, because this is the point. I'm trying to point out that CalOSHA at this point is almost a non-functioning agency under Christine Baker. She has ridden herd over. She replaced Ellen Wides 2 months later, kicked her out, put in somebody who was going to be basically a do-nothing chief of CalOSHA. And that's what CalOSHA is doing now. Virtually nothing. They haven't even looked at Hunters Point. Okay, so to go on about Christine Baker, she just resigned 2 months ago. You say, oh, how did that happen? And then it came out in the Chronicle that she was being investigated for fraud, called nepotism fraud. She brought on her brother and gave him huge raises, and he just retired too, mysteriously. And she brought on her daughter, and who's been working there for a couple of years, never goes in the office and gets a big paycheck. So, that is, she should be brought up on charges, criminal charges, and nothing's being done right now. We'll see what happens with that. And the thing I want to get into, though, I guess, is this: what is occurring at Hunters Point is a monument, the worst eco-fraud in the history of the United States. That's how bad it is. What was going on at Hunters Point? The Navy from 1946 to 1964 was doing ionizing radiation experiments on animals and some volunteers. And these were the spewing of ionizing radiation nuclides from these experiments was just, it wasn't controlled. It polluted the whole 450 acres at Hunters Point. Okay, after that, what occurred was they were setting off these hydrogen bomb, remember that? Hydrogen bomb explosions in the Pacific Ocean. And they put a lot of Navy ships out there. And those Navy ships were downwind, and they got highly polluted. Where did they go? They went to Hunters Point for cleanup. And where does that cleanup residue go? It spreads all over the place. The air, the soil, whatever water's there, etc., the buildings. So Hunters Point is a highly radioactive polluted area, no question. And these radioactive nuclides are radioactive for tens of thousands of years. This is not something that's sort of, 10, 15 years down the line. This will get, diluted with time. No, it doesn't get diluted with time. And then the Navy brings in, I'll put it, a crooked group of testers, a corporation, and they do the testing, and they find out that the testing was all fraudulent, all of it. And Tetra Tech is the name of the corporation. And then Tetra Tech proceeded to declare that large areas were free of pollution because they hadn't really tested it. They did phony testing. So then the trucks came in to haul off the polluted soils. The trucks all going through San Francisco, particularly Bayview, Hunters Point, those people who live there are exposed to truckloads of this radioactive soil. It goes to 4 solid waste disposal sites. Solid waste disposal in no way protects people against that kind of highly radioactive pollution. It's going to run off, it's going to get in the air, it's going to pollute all of the neighborhoods around those solid landfills. That too is... Okay. That too is an outrage. And, all of that has been coming out somewhat in the Chronicle, and Steve has been fantastic. He has been really on top of it and watching the whole thing develop. The workers who worked for Tetra Tech, starting around 2004 with the testing, there were, I think, 6 of them that were truth tellers or whistleblowers and said, they're not doing things right at all. In fact, they're creating false data. And all of them got fired. And, they're still fighting that battle. And Steve can tell you more about that. He knows the details. The point is, though, that we have an agency, the Department of Industrial Relations, CalOSHA, that should have been on top of this. Workers were getting exposed. And by the way, one other additional point is that there are a lot of other pollutants out there because this was an industrial site. You've got asbestos and the heavy metals, lead, arsenic, etc., cadmium. And you have a lot of industrial detergents and solvents, also polluting the soil out there. So you have a panoply, and you look at that and you say, well, how are they going to remediate that? How are they going to build houses through Lennar, the big contractor? And by the way, let me just quickly tell you this, without going into the details. The politicians that are involved in this start with Willie Brown, Gavin Newsom, Ed Lee, and then you look at Pelosi, it's Pelosi's nephew that is in charge of the building, and Gavin Newsom is connected to him too. They know each other, all good friends. So now we have Pelosi intimately involved in this outrage, and Dianne Feinstein's husband, Bloom, Mr. Richard Bloom, is a big billionaire, and his corporation is connected to the development corporations out at Hunters Point, and also is connected to the development at Treasure Island. Similar kinds of pollution at Treasure Island, but now nowhere as intense, put it that way. So you ask, well, what can they do? I mean, what are they going to build on top of this, even though they haven't got it cleaned up? Well, they have a remediation they do often. We do a cap on it, 6 inches of topsoil, free of pollution. Well, what the hell is that going to get you? Plants don't go down just 6 inches in their roots. Whatever grows there or whatever gets kicked up by the weather is going to get in the air and pollute workers. And they're building, their present plan is to build something like 12,000 homes on sectors G and D. The EPA came in and looked at that. The local director of EPA Superfund sites and said 97% of the testing that was done by Tetra Tech is false, which means it was never really tested, and they were going ahead and making the plans to build these 12,000 homes, plus the commercial properties, which are going to be millions of square feet of commercial properties on those two parcels, G and B. And this just gives you an idea of the magnitude and depth of corruption going on at Hunters Point, and the lack of any adequate close looking at it and seeing how did this occur, and why are we ever going to allow any building on there at all.